Welcome. The latest PMI data out of China for September 2025 points to one single critical conclusion. The economy is moving on two separate tracks. Now, while the headline figures might suggest a fragile stabilization, a deeper dive into the analysis reveals a pretty significant divergence between a resilient export sector and a struggling domestic core. So let's break down the data that supports this thesis. So, right off the bat, the September data presents us with a puzzle. We've got two key manufacturing surveys, and they're pointing in completely opposite directions. The official government survey indicates a sixth straight month of contraction. At the same time, the private survey is showing its strongest expansion in 6 months. So how can both of these be true? Well, this isn't a case of one survey being right and the other being wrong. What these conflicting numbers are really showing us is an economy that is fundamentally splitting apart. We're observing what economists call a K-shaped recovery, where different segments are moving in very different directions. So let's start with part one, manufacturing's widening gap. We're going to deconstruct the economy's engine room, where we're seeing a growing imbalance between factory production and actual customer demand. On the supply side, the initial signal looks pretty positive. The production subindex rose to 51.9, which is a 6-month high. This tells us that factories are accelerating their output, the assembly lines are running faster, likely in anticipation of future business. But, and this is a big but, this production surge is dangerously mismatched with actual demand. The new orders index, a key measure of what customers are buying, remains in contraction territory at 49.7. This disconnect is absolutely critical. Factories are producing more goods for which there simply aren't enough buyers yet. This growing divide creates what analysts call a supply-demand scissor gap. And you can just picture the two blades of a pair of scissors moving apart. It's an unsustainable situation that eventually leads to inventory pileups and forces businesses to start cutting their prices. And the immediate consequence is right here in the pricing data. You can see that manufacturers are getting caught in a pretty significant profit squeeze. Their input costs for raw materials are still rising, while factory gate prices, what they charge for their finished goods, continue to fall. They're paying more while earning less. Now, this economic pressure isn't being felt equally across the board, and that brings us to part two, a tale of two firms, where we'll bring the K-shaped nature of this recovery into sharp focus. The official data gives us a really clear breakdown. Large, state-backed enterprises are expanding, but the situation really deteriorates for the smaller firms. Both medium-sized and small private businesses remain in contraction territory. This is the textbook definition of that K-shaped recovery we mentioned. The top arm of the K represents the large, state-supported firms that are rising. The bottom arm represents the small and medium private firms, and they're falling. They're experiencing two completely different economic realities. All right, let's turn to the non-manufacturing sectors for part three. We're going to look at services and construction because instead of acting as pillars of growth, both are showing signs of stalling out.
The service sector's expansion has ground to a near halt, just barely expanding. But what's even more concerning is the forward-looking indicator for new orders, which is contracting sharply. This suggests that activity is likely to weaken even further in the coming months.
Meanwhile, the construction sector continues to be a major drag on the economy. Activity is contracting and new orders remain at alarmingly low levels. This really indicates that the long-running property crisis is far from over and continues to weigh very heavily on growth. Okay, this brings us to part four, and back to our initial puzzle. How can the official and private manufacturing surveys be so different? Well, the answer lies in what exactly each survey is measuring. The key difference is their methodology. You see, the official survey is weighted towards those large state-owned firms that serve the domestic market. In contrast, the private survey focuses on smaller, private companies that are primarily export-oriented. They're talking to two different groups. And when you place the key indicators side by side like this, the divergence is crystal clear. The private survey strength is being driven by a surge in new export orders, which return to expansion for the first time in 6 months. This, right here, is the critical differentiator. So this data confirms the existence of what we're calling a dual-track economy. Track 1 is the large domestic-focused economy, that's represented by the official PMI, and it's struggling with weak internal demand. Track 2 is the resilient, export-oriented economy, captured by the private survey, and it's recovering on the back of solid global demand. So to summarize, the September data reveals an economy that is far from uniform. It's really a story of division, imbalance, and a two-speed recovery. The headline numbers don't just hide the details. In this case, they actively obscure the real story of two different economies operating under one flag. And this leaves us with the critical question for the future. The data has defined these two tracks. Now we have to watch to see which one will ultimately set the direction for the entire Chinese economy. Can the export engine pull the rest of the train along, or will the weight of the domestic carriages bring everything to a halt?